This lecture is going to cover the endocrine system, and we're not going to be talking so much about the functionality, a little tiny bit, but we're going to be talking about the main endocrine organs and where they are in the body and a little bit about how they react. So basically the idea for the body is that the body, in order to remain healthy, has to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is defined as the coordination of organs and systems throughout the body that maintains a regular, healthy functioning. The nervous system and the endocrine system work to communicate throughout the body to maintain homeostasis. So the nervous system communicates really quick, short-term responses through electrical chemical activity. Endocrine activity is a little different. Endocrine activity gives chemical signals to the body, allows those signals to travel through the bloodstream, and those chemical signals are delivered to tissues that will have a longer effect. Those chemical signals, or the chemicals themselves, are called hormones, all right? Hormones are molecules that are going to alter the metabolism of cells and the organs within which the cells reside. So the idea is that a hormone, a chemical, a naturally occurring chemical in our body, is going to change the chemistry of cells and organs. And remember, metabolism is defined as all of the chemical reactions in a cell over the cell's life, basically. So let's define the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a series of tissues and cells that secrete hormones that have targets elsewhere in the body. So the endocrine cells are typically glandular secretory cells that make and release hormones, usually through exocytosis, into interstitial fluids. So basically the idea is you have this gland with vesicles in it, or a cell. Let's just start with the cell. And the cell exocytoses each one of these into the environment where it could be picked up by the blood. When the hormone gets into the blood, it's going to travel elsewhere in the body to, let's say, whatever the target is. So let's say, for example, epinephrine, okay, adrenaline. It's made by the adrenal glands, and as the adrenals exocytose epinephrine into the interstitial fluid, okay, the salty solution surrounding the cells, eventually the epinephrine hits the bloodstream and it travels very quickly to its target cells. The targets are going to be the respiratory system, muscles in the eyes, skeletal muscle, the heart, and those organs are the targets that are going to react to the epinephrine. So the hormone regulates metabolic processes of the target cells. It can change the target cell's activity. It can change the type of enzyme activity that happens inside the cell. And usually when it's an enzymatic step that's changed, the enzyme controls cellular activities downstream. So basically epinephrine here, our little dots of epinephrine, are causing things to happen inside of cells through the activation of enzymes. So usually you have the cell doing whatever process. All of a sudden you have a signal, which in this case would be epinephrine, okay? Then that causes a shift in activity. So instead of going in this direction, the cell's activity is going in this direction. And when I say activity, I mean cellular metabolic chemical actions. Kind of crazy, right? So how does endocrine activity work in the system? All right. So negative feedback is usually what regulates or turns on and turns off, actually, endocrine, what we call reflexes or actions. So direct negative feedback has 3 steps. Number 1, the endocrine cells respond to whatever the disturbance in homeostasis, the change in the environment, by releasing the hormone in the blood. Okay, so again, something happens. Let's say you're hiking in Yosemite and all of a sudden you see a big hungry bear, maybe not a hungry bear, let's put it this way. You see a bunch of bear cubs and then here's mama coming out of the woods, right? That would get my attention. Epinephrine or adrenaline would then be released by the adrenals into the bloodstream. Number 2, epinephrine would then stimulate the target cell. And in this case, cell or cells. Usually it's a bunch of cells that it's stimulating. And so the idea is that, again, you have epinephrine being secreted into the blood. You have it circulating, and then it's hitting its target. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, we're going to talk about skeletal muscle. All right. The epinephrine is going to interact with the target and make the target cells do something different. It's going to stimulate them to change their metabolism. So one of the things that skeletal muscle does is it holds on to glycogen. Glycogen is the human form of starch. Basically, we store additional sugar in the form of glycogen. So what's next? The target cell then responds to restore homeostasis. So in the case of running into bear cubs in the mom, your skeletal muscle has gotten a signal from your adrenals to start hydrolyzing glycogen. Remember, we just talked about glycogen. Glycogen gets hydrolyzed or cut up into glucose that the skeletal muscle can start using really, really fast to make energy and run you out of that area where those baby bears are, right? So the target response, glycogen cleavage in skeletal muscle cells, will allow you to run away from mama bear, hopefully getting you out of the situation, and eventually, once you're away from her and the cubs, restoring your homeostasis. The endocrine cells stop producing the hormone, usually like right around number 3. Now, it depends on the response. That's an acute response. Acute means that it's something short-lasting. Chronic responses are different, okay? And you'll talk a lot about that in physiology. So how is endocrine activity regulated? So it turns out that simple chain of events that I talked about was overly simplified. These chain of events are usually very complicated. What happens is you have step 1. Let's go back a slide. You have step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 3 actually turns off step 1. The fact that the hydrolysis of glycogen induces an increase in blood sugar levels, that actually is part of what helps the disturbance. It helps stop the process. Now, in the case of sugar regulation, it's obviously a lot more complicated than that. So the secretion of one hormone triggers usually the secretion of a second hormone or a change, and that's delta, remember change from math, delta, in cell metabolism. If it is the secretion of the second hormone then is going to do something else, blah, 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 and you'll have hormone number 1 inducing hormone number 2, inducing hormone number 3, and sometimes hormone number 3 goes back and turns off hormone number 1. These are the more complicated metabolic endocrine activities, okay? So hormone regulation in negative feedback, the last compound made turns off the first one, okay? When we start talking about another process called positive feedback, this is a little bit differently because positive feedback increases the rate of a process, okay? It rushes the process to completion. So in this case, you'll have the secretion of a hormone that produces an effect that stimulates the release of the same hormone. So you'll have hormone number 1 causing an effect, which then makes more hormone number 1, causing more effect, and around and around and around and around we go, all right? And the completion of the process is when this hormone here is no longer needed because the effect has reached its, I guess you would say, maximum result. An example of this would be blood clotting. When we get a cut, it's very, very important that we get a little scab or initially a blood clot, right, to stop bleeding so that we don't hemorrhage. Well, there's a series of enzymes that are triggered when oxygen hits blood when you have an open wound, and those enzymes then cause other hormones and other compounds to become activated, and when they're activated, it causes the activation of another hormone, and eventually when the clot happens, you no longer have oxygen, in this example, coming into the area, causing that trigger of events. So then the process is turned off. Another example is childbirth. When the baby's head, when the baby gets big enough to be born, the baby's head puts pressure on the inside of the cervix. All right. So if you have the uterus, right, the uterus is here, and then you have the birth canal, and then you have the baby. I can only draw stick babies, okay? And the baby's all happy because the baby's going to be born. So when the baby is big enough and there's pressure right here on the beginning of the birth canal, the base of the cervix, okay, that causes a mild contraction of the smooth muscle of the uterus. That then induces secretion of oxytocin by the hypothalamus. Don't ask why that happens. That's a peripheral nervous system activation, okay? The PNS is wired into this smooth muscle. Remember we talked about that kind of thing in the last chapter? The PNS then tells the hypothalamus to release oxytocin. Oxytocin then makes the uterus contract harder. The harder contraction is measured by the receptors in the smooth muscle, and that goes back up to the brain. So the harder the contraction, the more oxytocin. The more oxytocin, the harder the contraction. So you have step number 1 going up to the brain, making oxytocin, not oxy, but oxytocin, which is coming back here. And so you have an amplification mechanism here until the baby is born. And once the baby is born, there's no longer any pressure right here at the base of the cervix. So then no more secretion or less secretion of oxytocin. So that's positive feedback. All right, those are the basic mechanisms that you're going to be talking about in physiology, negative feedback and positive feedback, and odds are you're going to start that the very first week that you guys are dealing with, the endocrine system. So you'll be hearing a whole lot more about that. Let's talk about the endocrine glands, where you can find them and basically what they do. We have the hypothalamus, which some people call the master endocrine gland. The hypothalamus is in the brain. It's part of the limbic system. It produces, like I said, oxytocin, but other regulatory hormones. In addition to ADH, antidiuretic hormone, is also called vasopressin, and it helps regulate how much water our kidneys release into the urinary stream. We have the pituitary gland. The pituitary is linked to the hypothalamus, and it has 2 sections, one called the adenohypophysis and the other one the neurohypophysis. I'll show you why that's the case. The adenohypophysis is the anterior lobe. The neurohypophysis is the posterior lobe. The thyroid gland. The thyroid is kind of this butterfly-shaped organ near your Adam's apple, it's where you find the thyroid cartilage, actually. It produces thyroxine, I can never say this one, triiodothyronine, and calcitonin. And basically what's happening with the thyroid and the parathyroids, actually it's the parathyroids that make the calcitonin. T4 and T3 are made by the thyroid. Is you have regulation of how quickly your body burns energy, like glucose. This is metabolism, energy metabolism. And when we talk about energy metabolism, it's basically how your body is using fats, carbohydrates, and protein. Thank you, the other biomolecule to build a body, for energy production, to keep you alive and keep you moving. Calcitonin regulates blood calcium levels, and basically that also regulates calcium levels in your bones. We have the adrenal glands. They are called suprarenal. Originally, they were called suprarenal glands. The adrenal glands look like these little yellow hats sitting on top of the kidneys. The adrenal glands make a whole bunch of things: epinephrine, norepinephrine. This is adrenaline, noradrenaline. They also make cortisol, corticosterone, aldosterone, and androgens. Androgens can be converted to testosterone or estrogen. The kidney itself does, and I'm bringing this up right now, the kidney itself is an organ that can have endocrine functions because it makes calcitriol. We'll talk about that later. And then erythropoietin. EPO is very, very important in blood cell regulation. So there is an endocrine element to the kidney itself. Coming back here to our list on the left, we have the pancreas. The pancreas is an important gland because what it does it's right here, is it produces insulin and glucagon. We're really familiar with the molecule insulin because insulin helps regulate blood sugar levels, right? You eat something sweet and glucose is going to interact, glucose, or at least the increase in glucose in your bloodstream, is going to allow your pancreas is going to make insulin so that your cells can absorb that glucose and use it. Glucagon is the opposite, I guess you would say, of insulin. If you do not have a lot of blood sugar, all right, have you ever like not eaten for a while and you get grumpy and you feel kind of grouchy and maybe a little bit lightheaded sometimes? What's happening is there's a signal going through your system and the pancreas is going to start releasing glucagon. Glucagon then signals the liver to start releasing glucose basically into the bloodstream. It's a really important signal because this is where we're making our own carbohydrates. The liver will store carbohydrates in the form of glycogen. Haha, remember that again? In the form of glycogen in the liver tissue itself. And if glucagon's floating around, then you're going to start utilizing that glycogen to survive on. So if you've ever had those periods of time where, you know, you feel okay and then you don't feel so good, and then you kind of return and you're kind of like up and down, but you're hungry, this is the action of glucagon. And what's interesting is it's also the action of insulin. So insulin and glucagon work together to keep blood glucose levels relatively stable. We have reproductive organs, testes and ovaries. Since this is a male model here, obviously they're pointing to the testes. They're the male gonads. They produce androgens, especially testosterone, but testosterone can be converted to other things. There's another compound called inhibin. Don't worry about that. The ovaries in a female produce estrogens, progestins, and also inhibin. Again, this is a don't worry about that right now, but we all know what estrogen, progesterone basically are. And estrogen and testosterone are one enzymatic reaction away from each other. They're almost exactly the same molecule. It's pretty interesting. The thymus, which is located kind of close to the heart, right here, okay, it's definitely inferior to the thyroid itself and the parathyroids. The thymus produces thymosins, and basically the thymus is pretty big when we're young, but it starts shrinking down, or it undergoes atrophy as we age into adulthood. And so this is part of our immune regulation system. The pineal gland is way, way deep in the brain. You can't even see it. They're just kind of putting a little arrow here. The pineal gland produces melatonin, and melatonin is a key molecule for helping us kind of start settling down for the night. Melatonin is secreted as day length, or basically as the light intensity of the day changes. So if we have long, long days, real bright sunny days, you don't have a lot of melatonin around until it starts becoming dusk. Once the sun starts going down and the light gets more dim, melatonin starts being produced, and that's signaling your brain and your body, hey, time to go to bed so that we can prepare for the next day. We can heal wounds, we can repair any damage, so we're ready for the next day. Melatonin, interestingly, is also made in the digestive tract. Actually, it's serotonin. Serotonin can then be converted to melatonin in the brain. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Sorry, it's serotonin. Serotonin is also another neurotransmitter in the brain that helps you feel good. Other tissues, we did talk about the pineal, parathyroids. The heart does have some endocrine regulatory elements. The kidney we talked about. Adipose tissue or fat, they make leptin and resistin. Leptin is a hormone that when your fat cells are full, tells you, hey, we're full. Don't put any more food down here. We're not hungry. We're full. We have enough energy. One of the key problems in today's society is that sugar overrides the leptin response to the brain. And so people who eat a lot of sugar or a lot of processed foods end up having a misrepresentation, not a misrepresentation, but a misunderstanding of leptin. What happens is that sugar masks the parts of the brain that would be listening to leptin, and so leptin can't get its message through, and then you still feel hungry. And so what ends up happening is you have this constant jonesing or hankering for more sugar, more food, more food. You have a high appetite, maybe not a high hunger, but a high appetite. So learning a leptin, having your brain understand the leptin message is a big deal in regulating energy metabolism in your body. Digestive tract, like I said, there are a lot of hormones there. One in particular, serotonin. When you eat, serotonin is produced to actually control peristalsis in the digestive tract. Serotonin can get into your bloodstream and get up to your brain and make you feel good. So when you eat that cookie, it feels so good. I know. And then the pancreatic islets we talked about. So we're going to review a few of these glands. The endocrine glands and cells are located throughout the body. This is the picture from your book. I just use this one because I find that it's a better representation. It's a bigger listing. You can read it better, basically. Pineal gland, it's attached to the floor of the third ventricle, makes melatonin derived from serotonin. There you go. And basically what it does is, again, makes you sleepy, but it can also inhibit hypothalamic RH, it's a hormone, don't worry about it, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And so basically what happens is when you have a lot of melatonin around, it slows down the maturation of gametes. RH is release hormone. The cells that make melatonin are linked into the visual pathway to help measure basically light levels. So decreases in daytime, increases it. Melatonin secretion decreases in the daytime because light is bright. It increases at night because light is dim. And that helps regulate our other circadian rhythms. We have a day-night cycle because basically the pineal is saying, okay, go rest now. We're going to do these other things. And then when it's sunny, you can come out and do your whatever you do again. Hypothalamus, the master endocrine gland, it regulates both the nervous system, NS, and the endocrine system, ES, in 3 ways. It produces releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. Now, lucky you guys, you don't have to deal with what these hormones are right now. That is the world's ugliest arrow. Let's try that again. So we're just going to leave it as releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones for now. ADH, anti-dietary hormone, or vasopressin, and oxytocin. They're transported to the posterior pituitary for storage. We'll see a picture of this in a minute. And then the hypothalamus automatically regulates other endocrine glands like the adrenal medulla, which has a lot to do with sympathetic stimulation. Remember, the hypothalamus may give your adrenal medulla a jolt so that hormones will be released. And remember, this is one pathway that does not have a preganglionic and postganglionic. Well, I'm sorry, that's the adrenals. This is the adrenals, not the hypothalamus. We'll get to that in a minute. But remember, the adrenals do not have pre and post ganglionic fibers from the spinal cord. The hypothalamus tells the spinal cord, hey, you tell that adrenal medulla to start releasing stuff, and boom, it goes. And so here's actually, this is a great way to use our current figures in the book. Here's the thalamus. The hypothalamus is in this blue region here. When you look at a living brain, sometimes you can kind of see it. It's a slightly different color. The infundibulum is this little stalk by which the pituitary gland is connected to the brain. The pituitary has a posterior aspect and an anterior aspect. We'll talk about that in a minute. In the sheep brains that you guys are dissecting, a lot of times when they're preparing the sheep brain, the pituitary gets kind of like popped off when they remove the brain from the sheep's skull cavity. So many of you will not have a pituitary, but those of you who do may want to point that out in your video. And what you would be able to see though is just the kind of where the infundibulum was, where the tissue had been torn. So the pituitary, like I said, has 2 lobes, the adenohypophysis, anterior, neurohypophysis, which is posterior. How do I remember which is which, Dr. Val? Anterior and adeno, or adeno, however you want to say it, both start with A, so they go together. The adenohypophysis is very glandular. It produces 7 hormones that you'll learn in physiology, and this secretes basically right into the bloodstream. So it's glandular, and it's surrounded by lots of blood vessels. Surrounded by and actually intercalated with. The neurohypophysis, basically, it's not glandular, and what it is the axon terminals for cells in the hypothalamus. What is Val talking about? Here's the anterior, here's the posterior. It can also be, and the posterior is broken down into the pars nervosa, and don't worry about that. I just want to know adenohypophysis, neurohypophysis, anterior, posterior. Here's the optic chiasm. Here's the third ventricle right here. And so here's the and the hypothalamus would be up here. Okay. The hypothalamus is basically going to send axons down here like this, where whatever signal needs to be released into the bloodstream is released right here. Over here, you have axons synapsing onto cells that release the compound. Okay? So you have a different structure. Here is the pars distalis, the pars intermedia, which I'm not going to ask you about, and then the pars nervosa here. And the anterior lobe just has lots of glandular tissue producing compounds that go straight into circulation. Here, it gets squirted into circulation. So the hormones that are present in the adenohypophysis anterior pituitary, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ADH, causes, well, not ADH, ACH, I'm sorry, ADH. I love ADH, actually. That's why I always think about it. This is ACH, my bad. And this sends a signal to the adrenals to do things. That's all you need to know about right now. Luteinizing hormone, which is LH, both men and women have this. It produces ovulation in females, and it produces the production of basically sperm in men via androgen activation. So luteinizing hormone is basically getting gametes together. Okay, it's the gamete hormone. That's what I thought of it. The gamete hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, which is also called which is a class of hormone called a gonadotropin, gonad, right? It's a gonad hormone. This is going to signal gamete maturation. This is gamete production hormone, luteinizing hormone, okay? So it's saying, hey, start making hormones that are going to support the transition of cells from a stem cell into a gamete. So this is gamete production. That's how I thought of it. And this is gamete maturation hormone. And something that you just need to know for any endocrine process, and this will help you in physiology, is the term trophic hormone. Trophic hormones regulate how other hormones are secreted from other tissues. So gonadotropic hormones are hormones that regulate activities of the gonads. So over here, gonadotropins, they're luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are regulating processes and the secretion of other hormones in the gonads of males and females. Growth hormone, human growth hormone, stimulates the growth of muscle and cell. Basically, it helps you grow. It's general growth. And it induces the liver to make hormones that stimulate growth of other tissues. Thyroid stimulating hormone releases thyroid hormone from the thyroid. Okay, that one's easy. You'll hear a lot about that in physiology. Prolactin stimulates milk production from the mammary gland. It does not, however, produce milk release. It's just milk production. Oxytocin causes milk release and letdown. Melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH, right? It sounds like a news station, news channel. Stimulates melanocytes to make more melanin, which would be very important in the summertime when you're in the sun more often. It's typically not produced in healthy adults unless you're in the sun a lot, but it is produced actually in pregnant women. MSH is regulated by other hormones, and so sometimes pregnant women will end up getting a condition called melasma, or increased melanin production, where they end up getting spots on their face, on their hands, and sometimes on their belly, because MSH is stimulated. And so here's another drawing from your book showing you the anterior and posterior pituitary, adenohypophysis, and neurohypophysis. So now let's talk about the neurohypophysis. The hormones are produced by the hypothalamus and shipped out and squirted out, basically released in the neural hypophysis. Big one, oxytocin. This is going to stimulate uterine and mammary smooth muscle contractions for birth and milk release for nursing. And in males, it causes contraction of smooth muscle in the prostate gland for fertilization. So oxytocin is very important for reproductive and child rearing purposes. ADH, vasopressin, targets the kidneys. ADH also targets blood vessels. And what it does is it causes a change in water loss and blood pressure so that you don't release water into the urine. So antidiuretic means that you're holding water in, okay? Diuretic means that you're losing water. When we say diuretic, it's usually relative to kidney action, not necessarily colonic action, although that can be diuretic as well. But ADH is usually talking about processes regulating how much water the kidneys are letting out. And if the kidneys are letting out more water, then you have less ADH. So an increase in urination means that you have a decrease in ADH. Opposite, increase in ADH, a decrease in urination. And so this is what I was talking about. The cells up here in the hypothalamus send their axons all the way down here to the posterior pituitary, and they squirt right into a bed of blood vessels where the oxytocin or antidiuretic hormone can circulate around to where it needs to go. Excuse me. And so here's another example. The secretion of regulatory hormones cause secretion of a compound into the bloodstream in the adenohypophysis, and the hypothalamus actually releases here. The whole reason I put this in here isn't so much, this is a slide from physiology. It's not so much that you can look at process 1, 2, and 3. It's more so that you can see this one axon coming down here into the neural hypophysis, and then ADH, oxytocin causing things to happen. We're gonna ignore the adrenals in this slide. So here are some targets for the hypothalamus: the adrenal glands, the thyroid, bone and muscle, mammary glands, reproductive organs, melanocytes, and the kidneys. So this is, you should probably know some of what's going on here. You don't necessarily need to know all the names of the hormones, but it's a good thing to know that the anterior and posterior pituitary are targeting these specific set of organs. And so the easy thing is if you learn them all, then you just set aside 3, and that's the posterior. Posterior has 3 targets, 3 main targets. Okay, let's move on to the thyroid. The thyroid is anterior to the trachea. It has 2 lobes on the right and the left, and it connects anteriorly around the trachea at a region called the isthmus. It produces thyroxine. Thyroxine is produced by follicle cells inside of the thyroid. I'll show you what follicle cells look like. There's a reason they're called follicles, actually. Oh, excuse me. Oh, I think I need more coffee. Thyroxine helps regulate TRH and TSH. In other words, TRH and TSH are hormones that are going to be going out and telling your body how fast to consume energy. Okay, you're going to learn that in physiology. Now, calcitonin is regulated by things called parafollicular cells. It's produced and regulated. It decreases calcium in the bloodstream. It inhibits osteoclasts and causes calcium to go out through the urinary stream. So basically, calcitonin is going to be removing calcium from your body if you have too much calcium, ionic calcium. And that's why we have these 2 pluses here. That designates it as ionic calcium. Gets rid of ionic calcium in your bloodstream. So here's a picture of the thyroid. Again, very, very vascularized. The thyroid follicles look like, to me, little swimming pools. And these thyroid follicles are where T3 and T4 is produced or activated. The adjacent tissue is glandular tissue. Okay, doing other jobs. Don't worry about that right now. But this is where T3 and T4 is going to be produced or activated. And of course, secretion goes into blood vessels, usually the red ones here. Because remember, the blue ones go back to the heart. Here's another example of a drawing of the thyroid gland from your book so that you can see the anterior and the posterior view. Now the parathyroids, these are really fun. To me, they always look kind of like little red hots, even though in this picture they're purple. The parathyroids make parathyroid hormone, PTH. And what this does is it stimulates osteocytes, usually osteoclasts. Remember from Unit 2, the osteoclasts, the bones, right? It stimulates bones to use calcium. It also, by stimulating bone to use up calcium and basically plaster calcium on our bones, it reduces kidney secretion, okay, or excretion. In other words, we don't have to deal with calcitonin. So if our osteoclasts are not using the calcium, then the thyroid's going to make calcitonin, okay? But if our osteoclasts are using calcium, ionic calcium, right here, okay, because it's getting PTH, then the kidneys don't have to get rid of the calcium. It stimulates the kidney hormone calcitriol, okay, which increases intestinal absorption of calcium. What does that mean? That means that if you are absorbing calcium from your intestinal stream, you're absorbing the calcium from the milk, the cheese, the green veggies that you've been eating, and it enters your bloodstream where it can be used. All right. So calcitriol is made by the kidney, which then calcium can be used by osteoclasts when the parathyroids are saying, hey, go ahead and make more bone. And so here's another picture showing you another example of the parathyroids in a drawing from your book. All right, let's talk about the adrenals now. The adrenals are called suprarenal because they're on top of the kidneys. Renal always has to do with kidney stuff, okay? They're on the superior border of each kidney. They're on the top, and they're attached by something called a fibrous capsule. It's a piece of connective tissue holding it onto the kidney. It is not continuous with the kidney, though, okay? It does not, you don't have a physical connection. Like the kidney cells don't go straight into adrenal cells. There's a separation between the two. The adrenals are broken into several regions. There is an adrenal cortex and an adrenal medulla. One of the things about the word cortex is that cortex means that you're going to have stacks of cells, all right? Now, I tend to draw them columnar. You'll see what I mean. They'll be kind of in stacks organized like this. A medulla has an unorganized collection of cells, okay? They're just kind of like marbles in a sock, all right? So the cortex, oh, and so remember I said something about earlier on, maybe you don't. When I talked about follicle means something, a follicle is a term where you have a circular structure with something in the middle, okay? And it's usually going to contain some sort of fluid. So follicle means you have a circular structure, usually with some fluid in there. Cortex means you have kind of a columnar structure, stacks of cells, and medulla means that you have kind of like a loose aggregation of cells, kind of like marbles in a sock. The adrenal cortex has 3 zones or layers. The zona glomerulosa that makes aldosterone. This helps regulate sodium levels in your blood by regulating sodium in your kidneys. In other words, not aldosterone. There's my Hispanic background. Aldosterone, sorry. Aldosterone is going to regulate whether or not your kidneys release sodium. So if you've eaten Panda Express and you have and I'm picking on Panda, sorry if any of you work at Panda, but it's pretty salty food, okay? Then your aldosterone levels are going to change because you have a lot of extra additional sodium in your system. The zona fasciculata produces cortisone, all right? Cortisone is a big deal. I mean, we talk about cortisol, the stress hormone, that comes from cortisone. And so basically cortisol is going to help regulate glucose and glycogen in your body, cortisone especially. So basically it's going to allow your body to make the choice. Am I going to use the sugar or am I going to store the sugar? And then the zona reticularis produces testosterone, which stimulates libido. And this is true in both males and females. Ladies, we do have some testosterone in us. If our testosterone is slightly higher, stimulates the libido. If testosterone goes down, well, the opposite happens. And the same with males. The adrenal medulla, the outermost region, okay, innermost, outermost. What am I talking about? The innermost, the medulla down here. I don't know why I said outermost. is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Okay, it secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine, and so this is basically all autonomic, fight or flight, rest and digest. All right, this is metabolism. This is metabolism too, but this is all autonomic. This is regulating how the cortex is regulating the everyday basic rest and digest processes. Actually, if epinephrine's going, then some of the cortical hormones are probably not going to be produced or paid attention to. If norepinephrine's being produced, then the cortical hormones are more important. So this epinephrine shuts a lot of things off because it's got to get you out of that stressful situation, right? When mama bear wants to escort you away from the baby bears. So here's a picture showing you the suprarenal positioning of the adrenal glands on the patient's left and right, which is your right and left, right? This is the superior border of the kidney. And so the adrenals, just like the kidneys, are wired into circulation. And interestingly, I love this about the adrenals, is there's a huge, huge blood vessel, the inferior phrenic arteries, which take compounds, which take the adrenaline or noradrenaline and put it right here into the abdominal aorta to spread it really quick throughout your body. I mean, this is like kaboom. You know when you've had an epinephrine or an adrenaline rush because the adrenaline is dumped basically straight into your abdominal aorta and it hits the target super fast. We will be learning all of these blood vessels when we get to the blood vessels. Hold off on that right now. Here's an artist rendition of the adrenal medulla versus the adrenal cortex. And again, look, cortex looks columnar, medulla looks loose. Here is the adrenal cortex here. Again, look at all these little purple dots. Those are nuclei. Here's the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis, the deepest. And then here's the medulla. Now here's the capsule, the connective tissue that surrounds the adrenal, the adrenal gland itself. Here's another drawing showing you the flipped version of what I just showed you, the glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis, and the adrenal medulla. All right, let's move on to the pancreas now. The pancreas is both endocrine and exocrine. That's interesting, right? Basically what's happening is the endocrine response is the alpha cells producing glucagon, which tells the liver to start breaking down glycogen because we don't have a whole lot of glucose in the system, or the beta cells making insulin, which is signaling the absorption or the uptake of glucose in your system because you have an increase of blood sugar, okay? So blood sugar goes up, insulin goes up, blood sugar goes down, all right? Delta cells, however, produce something called somatostatin, and this is growth factor inhibiting factor. What that means is that human growth factor is inhibited via somatostatin, all right? We're not going to go into the regulatory processes for that, but you just need to be aware that there are 3 types of cells in the pancreas that produce hormones, alpha, beta, delta, and that's glucagon, insulin, and somatostatin. Here's a separate picture showing you or at least a drawing of the pancreatic islets. You can see the alpha cells and the beta cells, which are much smaller, and then the exocrine acini right here, these little white pathways. Those are the little tubes taking the hormones out so that they can be picked up by the circulatory system. And I guess I'll just mention for now that the pancreas also makes digestive enzymes. We'll talk about that in the digestive system. The acinar cells here secrete digestive enzymes that are then transported into the duodenum of the small intestine where they interact with food and start digesting food, right? We need that so that we can have energy. The thymus is kind of superior to the heart. Excuse me, here I am yelling again. Posterior to the sternum, so the thymus is behind the sternum. The thymus produces thymosin, and that stimulates the development and maturation of lymphocytes, white blood cells, which is happening at the highest rate when we're young, but starts slowing down as we enter adulthood and mature into later adulthood. The last endocrine organs that I'm just going to mention, because we're going to talk about these in more detail in the reproductive system, are the ovaries and the testes. Both the ovaries and testes have endocrine and exocrine activities. They both reside. at least the ovaries are in the pelvic cavity, early in development and early in males' infancy, the testes can still be inside the pelvic cavity. However, they do drop down into the scrotum as the male starts to develop a little more. Oocytes begin to mature inside of ovarian follicles, which look like little brown pools again with liquid inside of them, in response to follicle stimulating hormone that's produced in the hypothalamus, right? And so the follicle cells produce estrogen, which is also called, and actually it's more appropriately called, estradiol. The follicle cells, these little cells on the outside, make estradiol. After ovulation, what ends up happening is the corpus luteum inside of the, so ovulation, let's back up a minute. So you have estrogen or estradiol increasing by these cells in the follicle, okay? And then as those cells peak and stop producing estradiol, the corpus luteum in the uterus starts producing progesterone, which is also called progestins. Progestins is a general term, just like estrogen is a general term. Estradiol is the specific type of estrogen. Progesterone is the specific type of progestin, okay? Don't worry about why we have like estrogen versus estradiol. It has to do with the atomic structure, okay? So after estradiol goes down, progesterone starts going up. Okay, actually, I should underline this. Yeah, because progesterone is the hormone, progestin is the group. Progesterone starts increasing to prepare the corpus luteum, the lining of the uterus, for implantation of the fertilized ovum. And so estrogens stimulate ovarian follicle maturation. And it's a female secondary, it causes female secondary sexual characteristics, which is part of the exocrine function. In other words, once estradiol starts being produced, females start looking different. They start looking like young ladies, not little girls. It also stimulates the growth of the uterine lining to some degree. And then progesterone stimulates the uterus to prepare for implantation of the zygote, and it increases the movement of the oocyte through the uterine tube through peristalsis of smooth muscles along the length of the uterine or fallopian tube. In the testes, again, endocrine and exocrine, testes are found in the scrotum of mature males and young males as well. They contain interstitial cells that produce androgens, specifically testosterone. Testosterone is a type of androgen, okay? There are other androgens as well. Testosterone stimulates sperm production, also sperm maturation, helps maintain the secretory glands within the male reproductive system, and stimulates muscle growth, thereby influencing the male sexual secondary characteristics of larger muscles or greater muscle mass, but also increases the growth of stiff hair or stiff fur. Actually, the doctors call it fur. It's kind of funny. On the face and the chest of males. Again, another secondary sexual characteristic. All right, that is the end of chapter 17.